Today we're talking about the physical laws that govern energy flow and chemical cycling in ecosystems, also known as ecosystem ecology. Our working definition of an ecosystem is all of the organisms, the biotic part of a community, which is made up of multiple species, as well as the abiotic or the non-living factors with which they interact. Remember that energy flows in one direction through an ecosystem. However, matter is cycled through an ecosystem. So energy flows in one direction and eventually is lost from that system, usually in the form of heat. And matter tends to be cyclical and will cycle back through your trophic levels, and we'll get to that in just a few slides. Ecosystem ecology involves both energy flow as well as chemical cycling. Energy flows through an ecosystem and it cannot be recycled. You cannot capture the energy once it leaves as heat. Once it's gone to the universe, it's gone to the universe. And that is due to the first law of thermodynamics, which states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, merely transformed. So we can take it from one form to another as it moves through a trophic pyramid, but it cannot be recaptured. The second law of thermodynamics states that every exchange of energy increases the entropy of the universe. So what this is basically saying for us is that energy is lost as heat, and we see this at every level through an ecosystem. Energy has to be constantly added to the ecosystem, and this is done through autotrophs who capture energy from the sun and convert that light energy into chemical energy through photosynthesis. Once it's been captured in the chemical energy form through photosynthesis, then it's available to organisms that eat plants and organisms that eat other organisms that eat plants. So it now becomes available within an ecosystem. When we talk about an ecosystem, we can say that all the organisms are powered by the sun. The sun is the ultimate provider of energy in any ecosystem. Autotrophs build molecules themselves using photosynthesis or chemosynthesis if they're deep in the sea. They would use chemicals to build glucose molecules rather than the sun. They're a pretty small group of organisms, and we're going to focus mostly on the autotrophs that are photosynthetic for our purposes here. They'll use the sun as an energy source, and they support all the other organisms in the ecosystem. So at the very bottom level of our pyramid are the primary producers, also called the autotrophs. And auto is self, troph is feed or to eat, so it's self-feeding. Primary consumers, or herbivores, eat autotrophs. Secondary consumers, which are carnivores, eat herbivores. And tertiary consumers are carnivores that eat other carnivores. You may see a quaternary level consumer, but typically we're limited, and we'll talk about why later, to about 3 or 4 levels in any given pyramid or food chain. Detrivores and decomposers are consumers that derive their energy from detritus, which is non-living organic matter. Think of prokaryotes like bacteria and fungus. They're feeding on organic matter that is decaying or starting to break down, but is no longer considered living. This is a basic pictorial representation of what's going on. So we see down here that the sun is our main supplier of energy in an ecosystem, and the only organisms that can capture that light energy and convert it to chemical energy are your primary producers. So they're considered at the bottom of our ecosystem chain. Primary producers will either be eaten by primary consumers, or if they are to die off, we follow this blue arrow and they become detritus. And that detritus is broken down by detrivores, and that is the building blocks that then primary producers use to build more plant parts. As they convert energy from the sun to plant material and to glucose, some energy is lost in the form of heat, and we see this happens at every level. Our primary consumers eat the primary producers, which got their energy ultimately from the sun. They give off energy in the form of heat, so some energy is lost. And if they were to die, their organic material becomes detritus, which is broken down and enters at the bottom level of our food pyramid again. However, they could be eaten by secondary consumers as well. If they're eaten by secondary consumers, again, some energy is given off in the form of heat. And these organisms will either be eaten by their tertiary level consumers, or if they are to die off, they become detritus and enter the trophic pyramid as primary producers. Again, they're organic materials like a Lego, and you put a bunch of those Legos together to build a tower, and that's what the primary producers are doing. They're taking those compounds from the detritus, those building blocks, and they're building plant parts. So now we're going to shift our energy into talking about how energy and other limiting nutrients and other factors can control primary production in an ecosystem. The spending limit for an ecosystem's energy budget is determined by the primary producers in the ecosystem. So how much light can they convert to chemical energy? So those autotrophs are the ones doing the converting during a given period of time. The way we measure this is through gross primary production. So whenever we talk about the total primary production in an ecosystem, we are referring to the GPP, or the gross primary production. The net primary production, or the NPP, is the gross primary production minus the energy used by the autotrophs for respiration. So you're not allowed to include that in your total, because any of that energy is typically lost in the form of heat and does not travel to the next level of your trophic level pyramid. So to get NPP, we take the gross primary product and we subtract the amount of energy lost to respiration. And it is only the net primary production that is available to consumers. Here's a nice example of where most of our net primary production is. You can see at the very bottom of this scale, 0 is blackish and purple. And we notice that our oceans are not very productive in terms of energy. So we don't see a lot of energy coming out there, which makes sense because most of the oceans are deep and they don't have a lot of primary productivity going on. They don't have a lot of organisms that are photosynthesizing. We see a nice band right in this area of the equator that tends to have a lot higher net primary production. So we see a lot of primary production in the tropics. Primary production in aquatic ecosystems, in both marine and freshwater ecosystems, is dependent on both light and nutrients, and that controls the amount of primary production that you have. When we talk about the ocean or a lake, the depth of the light that can penetrate will affect the primary production of the photic zone. That's the part of the ocean or the lake that light can penetrate. Typically, the deeper you go in water, the more the wavelengths of light get disturbed and refracted. They cannot reach very deep into the water, so therefore most of your primary production happens right around the coast or the more shallow areas of water. Limiting nutrients are elements that have to be added for production to increase. And in marine production, it could be either nitrogen that you add or phosphorus. And if you have these in larger quantities, you tend to see more primary production for that particular organism, just depending upon what their limiting nutrient is, whether it's nitrogen or phosphorus. In this diagram, we can see that right off the coast of Long Island, we have different points, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, where measurements were taken to look at the primary productivity, or actually the amount of phytoplankton that grew off of the shore. And what they found, and they were getting a lot of runoff from farms, and so we can anticipate that there was also nutrient runoff, either nitrogen or phosphorus in this case. And the level of the bar represents how much phytoplankton growth there was as a result of that particular nutrient. So yellow is ammonium, which is nitrogen containing, so we can see in every single case it was nitrogen that when we increase the amount of ammonium, which would come from runoff from farms and agriculture, you would also increase the amount of phytoplankton. If we increase the amount of phosphate, or phosphorus containing material, that didn't really have an effect on how many phytoplankton you had. So our limiting factor in this case right off of Long Island is in fact nitrogen and not phosphorus for this particular species. It becomes a problem when we have an addition of large amounts of nutrients to lakes. This can have a huge amount of ecological impact, And what you see is in this lake right here, we can see that the water is very clear. It does not have a lot of runoff of agricultural waste such as nitrogen or phosphorus. And in this lake, we can see it's very green. It's not very clear. There's no clarity of the water. And in this lake, we've had what's called eutrophication. Eutros is well nourished in Greek, which means that you have a lot of that limiting nutrient in there. What happens is you get an increase in your growth of cyanobacteria and green algae. And so there is an overabundance of this population. They deplete the oxygen that's in the lake, and you tend to kill everything else in the lake. You kill off your fish unless they can handle really low oxygen levels in the water. And it pretty much destroys the habitat. You're creating a pretty unlivable environment. In terrestrial ecosystems, we are concerned with the amount of temperature, or the temperature, and the amount of moisture that affects your primary production. Evapotranspiration is evaporation and transpiration put together, and that amount is the water that leaves plants by transpiration and the water that leaves your landscape through evaporation. That is related to net primary production. If water is your limiting factor, you're going to tend to have a lot lower primary production than you would if you had an abundance of water. All right, let's talk about the rule of tens and why energy transfer in trophic levels is so inefficient. This is a great diagram to show us where the energy is going. Here we have a nice little green caterpillar, and he's eating plant material. From this plant material, he has about 200 joules of energy that he gets. Well, half of that right away is lost, pooped right out the back end. A lot of energy is not able to be processed. We lose a lot. 67 of those 200 joules is lost to cellular respiration, and only 33 joules is actually used for growth or new biomass. So only 1/6 of the leaf's energy is used for secondary production, for something other than keeping the organism alive through cell respiration and being lost in the form of heat or fecal matter. Trophic efficiency is the percentage of production transferred from one trophic level to the next. So from autotrophs to primary consumer to secondary consumers. Typically, we're looking at an average between 5% and 20% of the total energy available is actually transferred to the next level. So although this seems very inefficient, living organisms are much more efficient than, say, the vehicles that you drive. Those are even less efficient in being able to convert energy to workable energy. So trophic efficiency is multiplied over the length of a food chain, which is what causes our food chains to be fairly short. They don't go on and on and on, and you're never going to see a 5th level consumer or 6th level consumer. In this diagram, we can see that there is 1 million joules of sunlight, and this is just an arbitrary number picked out because it's really easy to divide by 10, so follow me for a second. If there are 10 or 1 million joules of sunlight available, that means that plants can make use of 10% of that available energy. So now the plant has at its availability 10,000 joules of sunlight. We divide that by 10 again as we move up a trophic level. So if a primary consumer were to eat those plants, they don't get all 10,000 joules of energy. What's available to them to do work is about 1,000 joules. If we go up one more level, this cute little wood rat were to eat that grasshopper, it does not get the 1,000 joules of energy that the grasshopper had. It only gets 10% of that, so it's down to 100 joules, and our 4th level consumer gets only 10 joules of that. So what we tend to see in a pyramid like this is that your primary producers tend to have the biggest amounts. There has to be a lot of those. Then your next level is much smaller, much smaller, much smaller, all the way to the top. If this were super big, there wouldn't be enough energy to support that large of a population of tertiary consumers, because they have to consume so many wood rats or secondary consumers in order to get enough energy to survive. So typically your pyramids are going to be heavy at the bottom and very light at the top, except for in one exception that we're going to see. Okay, so in a biomass pyramid, like I was saying, your primary producers are going to be the largest level. Their dry mass is a lot bigger than your primary consumers, secondary consumers, or tertiary consumers. And a pyramid of biomass is where you take the dry weight of all organisms in a trophic level and you just compare. And typically, we're going to see it again in an upright pyramid because you have to have a larger base than the next level up to support those organisms because there's such a huge loss. 90% of the available energy is lost as you move up each level. Down here we see that exception that I was talking about. Sometimes you'll see in an aquatic ecosystem an upside down pyramid. This is only going to be 2 levels, but phytoplankton tend to have a really fast turnover time. So what happens is they're able to reproduce so quickly that they are eaten by the primary consumers. So their population is never really allowed to get larger, but it turns over so quick that they're able to supply a large population of zooplankton with the required energy. So we focused a lot on the energy flow for an ecosystem, and now we're going to focus on how matter cycles through an ecosystem. So we're going to look at the inorganic parts or the abiotic parts of the ecosystem. Biogeochemical cycles is one big fancy word that really doesn't mean anything that fancy. If you were to break the word apart, we know that bio means life, geo means earth, and chemical means chemical. And this is how matter cycles throughout the earth. So nutrient cycles involve both biotic, so matter and nutrients are going to cycle through living organisms, and they're also going to cycle through abiotic components, like the weathering process and the rock cycle. And so we look at how nutrient flow and human alterations to the flow can be traced. This diagram shows us how inorganic and organic materials cycle through living organisms and also geologic processes. Let's start with organic materials that are available as nutrients. These tend to be in living organisms and detritus, so recently living organisms or dead organisms. If those organisms were to fossilize, they are still organic, but now they're unavailable as nutrients because they are in fossil form. Think of coal or oil or peat. That's organic material. If we want to release the organic material, we have to burn those fossil fuels, which takes us back down to reservoir C. The other option for our organic materials that are available is respiration, decomposition, and excretion. So if you were to excrete or decompose, now we have inorganic materials that are still available to us as nutrients. They're in the soil, so if you have something decomposing in the ground, in the water, in the atmosphere, we can get those inorganic materials. They are still available. When fossil fuels are burned, those become inorganic materials. They're available to us in the atmosphere as well as in the soil and water. If those inorganic materials form sedimentary rock, now they are unavailable to us as nutrients. So they're locked into a rock. Think of minerals and rocks. You cannot get to those. The only way to get to those, to go back to the inorganic available nutrients, is through weathering and erosion, so to go through part of that rock cycle. Once they've weathered, now they're available. Organisms can assimilate through photosynthesis these inorganic materials, convert them to organic materials in living organisms. The carbon cycle shows us how organisms use carbon in the atmosphere and how they use it as well. It's really important that you're able to identify the parts of each of the 4 biogeochemical cycles we're about to go through. So let's start here with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that is in the air. Plants take in CO2 through photosynthesis. Organisms eat plants. It enters the trophic level pyramid through plants taking it in through photosynthesis. If they are to decompose, then our CO2 becomes locked in the soil. It can also be dissolved in water, and it is respirated out. So as organisms go through cellular respiration and break down glucose, they are letting out CO2 as well. We're going to call this a pirate ship because Rena thinks it looks like a pirate ship. I think it looks like Titanic. Doesn't matter though. We are starting to contribute to the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere at an alarming rate. So we are a big producer of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we're actually altering the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere as a result of the burning of fossil fuels. There is an abundance of nitrogen in the atmosphere, however, it is unavailable to organisms. They cannot take that nitrogen from the atmosphere and assimilate it. So what we have are something called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They are able to take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it to ammonium through a process called ammonification. Okay, it gets converted to ammonia. And then we also have nitrifying bacteria that convert the ammonia to nitrite, which eventually gets converted to nitrate. Nitrate and ammonia are forms that plants can use. So those are some of the building blocks that the plants can take in and use it to form whatever organic materials they need, whether it be plant parts or for other processes. When those plants start to decompose, decomposers will break down the ammonia that they have again, and it repeats this cycle. Nitrogen is important because it's used in all of your amino acids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So every organism has to have nitrogen. And the main reservoirs we said in the diagram is the atmosphere. It gets converted to NH4 plus ammonium or nitrate, which plants can take up either through the nitrogen fixation. It does get decomposed to ammonia by ammonification and decomposed to nitrate by nitrification. And there are some bacteria that convert it back again to atmospheric nitrogen through denitrification. The water cycle is one of our easier cycles. When water falls in the form of precipitation, it will do a number of things. It will either run over the land until it reaches a body of water. It will soak into the ground to become groundwater. It will go into a lake, an ocean, or it gets taken up by plants and transpired out of the plants. Once it's in a body of water or in a plant, it gets evaporated again back into the atmosphere, and the cycle starts over again. The phosphorus cycle is very important. Every organism does need phosphorus, and typically organisms get their phosphorus in the form of phosphate, PO4, with a -3 charge. A lot of our phosphate comes from the weathering of rocks. There's a lot of phosphate as a mineral locked up in rocks. And so once that starts to weather, we get dissolved phosphate in oceans, and also plants can take up phosphate as needed in through assimilation. And then organisms that eat plants can therefore get the phosphate through consumption. Whenever we talk about ecosystem ecology, it's really important to keep in mind what role humans have and what impact we have on ecosystems. Acid precipitation or acid rain has been a big topic in the news. Snow, rain, or fog that has a pH less than 5.6, which is acidic, is considered acid precipitation. Burning of wood and fossil fuels will release compounds such as sulfur oxide and nitrogen oxides into the atmosphere. And when these guys get around water, they form sulfuric acid and nitric acid, which are pretty strong acids. And then, so they're reacting in the clouds, and they're starting to form these acids, and then that cloud will drop that moisture back on land. And what happens is the rain that has a lowered pH is going to really alter the ecosystem in which it lands. So now your soil has a pH that's pretty acidic. So what the result of that is you leach calcium and other nutrients out of the soil due to your low pH. We also tend to release a lot of toxic chemicals, and those toxic chemicals don't go away right away. They tend to persist for long periods. Sometimes they magnify in a trophic level. We get something called biological magnification, and this is concentrations of toxins at higher trophic levels where the biomass is lower. Let's look at this example. PCBs and DDT are great examples of how chemicals that we put into the ecosystem can magnify in higher levels, higher trophic levels. Phytoplankton will take up, in this case, PCBs, and they get eaten by smelt. So now the smelt has a higher concentration because they're eating a bunch of phytoplankton than the phytoplankton had. Lake trout eat the smelt, so now the levels of PCBs are even greater in the lake trout because the concentration is increasing. By the time herring gulls eat the lake trout, the magnification can be 5,000 times the level it was in phytoplankton. And in the case of DDT, we know that if you have such a high level of DDT in your system, such as eagles or whatever your tertiary consumer is in that particular chain, it can have adverse reactions such as shells that don't fully form, that aren't very hard, and so they break open before the bird is able to hatch and survive. And so this is just a great example of how toxins that are released can be magnified as we move up in a food chain and the biomass lowers. So it's a concentration of whatever chemical we put into the environment. Carbon dioxide, water, and other greenhouse gases will reflect infrared radiation back towards the Earth, and this is called the greenhouse effect. Do know that we really like the greenhouse effect. It's really important because it keeps the Earth nice and warm and toasty. We need to be able to keep some of that heat in from the sun. Otherwise, it would be freezing on Earth and we probably wouldn't even be alive. However, with the increasing amount of CO2 in our atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels, we are putting a thicker layer of CO2 on the Earth, which means we are trapping more heat. So there's less heat that's able to be released back into space. And the result of this is the Earth is starting to heat up at a rate that's not super great, but it is on an upward trend. This changes the distribution of precipitation, it changes weather patterns, it has some pretty lasting effects on the abiotic and biotic ecosystems. But remember that CO2 is like a blanket. And you want to have 1 or 2 blankets in the winter. It's really nice. It keeps the heat in. But you don't want to add 4 blankets, 5 blankets, 6 blankets. It's going to wind up getting too hot. And CO2 is the same way. You don't want to have too much CO2 in the environment. The Earth has an ozone layer around it. And ozone is a wonderful thing because it blocks a lot of that harmful UV radiation or ultraviolet radiation from the sun from penetrating and reaching us on the Earth's surface. Over time, humans have used products that contain chlorine, such as CFCs, and this actually decreases that layer of ozone, so it allows more UV radiation to penetrate and get to the Earth's surface. And the result for humans is we tend to have more of that DNA damaging ultraviolet radiation on the Earth's surface. So there tends to be a higher incidence of skin cancer, especially around where that ozone hole is. And our ozone hole is right around Australia.